Most Americans grow up believing that war is chaos, a tragic necessity, a failure of diplomacy, a last resort forced upon the nation by circumstance. That belief feels natural, it feels moral, and it feels true. But what if it isn't complete? What if, beneath the surface of every American war, there exists a structure so consistent, so repeatable, that it resembles not chaos at all, but a system? Before you reject that thought, pause for a moment. This is not a story about conspiracy. It is not speculation. It does not rely on secret documents or hidden cabals. Everything you're about to hear is drawn from public contracts, congressional investigations, financial records, and documented historical facts. The only reason most people have never seen the pattern is because no one lays it out in sequence. Until now. Here is the question that changes everything. If war were truly unpredictable, truly accidental, why do the same corporate dynasties profit from every major American conflict across centuries, ideologies, and administrations? The Revolutionary Era, the Civil War, World War I, World War II, Vietnam, the Gulf War, Iraq, Afghanistan, different enemies, different presidents, different justifications. Yet the winners remain strikingly familiar. That is not coincidence. And once you see the pattern, you cannot unsee it. Stay with me, because what follows is not an argument against soldiers, nor against necessary defense. It is an examination of incentives. And incentives, not intentions, are what shape history. Let's begin with a simple truth that most people avoid, because it is uncomfortable. War is not only destruction. War is also an economic event. It mobilizes capital, it reallocates labor, it concentrates power, and above all, it generates contracts. In the United States, war has always meant one thing with absolute certainty: massive government spending. When war begins, budgets are suspended, oversight is relaxed, speed becomes the justification for secrecy. Competitive bidding is replaced by urgency. Cost controls are replaced by necessity. Accountability is postponed until after victory. This environment is not an accident. It is fertile ground. And some families learned very early in American history how to position themselves so that every war, no matter how tragic, became financially transformative. The first of these families understood something fundamental before the United States was even fully formed: the DuPont family. If you recognize the name, you probably associate it with chemicals, plastics, or consumer products. But that is not where the fortune began. The DuPont empire was built on gunpowder. Eleuthère Irénée Dupont arrived in America in 1800, fleeing political instability in France. He was not a general, he was not a politician, he was a chemist, and he immediately noticed something critical about the young republic. America was expanding rapidly. Expansion required land clearing required explosives, and conflict was inevitable. In 1802, DuPont founded a gunpowder mill along the Brandywine River in Delaware. The location was strategic, close enough to supply the federal government, far enough from population centers to avoid scrutiny when explosions occurred. By the War of 1812, DuPont was supplying gunpowder to the U.S. military. This was the beginning of a relationship that would last more than 2 centuries. Here is the pattern DuPont pioneered. War begins. The government needs massive quantities of explosives immediately. DuPont already has capacity. Contracts are awarded. Production expands. Profits soar. When the war ends, the infrastructure remains. The mills do not disappear. The expertise does not vanish. The political relationships deepen. And when the next war begins, DuPont is already positioned. This is not opportunism. This is foresight. During the Mexican-American War in the 1840s, DuPont supplied artillery powder and munitions. The contracts were worth millions in modern dollars. But the real value was not revenue, it was precedent. When the Civil War erupted in 1861, the Union Army required explosives on an unprecedented scale. DuPont supplied more than half of all gunpowder used by Union forces. 4 years of continuous warfare, millions of rounds fired, factories running day and night. By the end of the Civil War, DuPont had become one of the most powerful industrial entities in the nation. And here is a detail that complicates the moral narrative. The DuPont family held mixed political views. Some opposed abolition, some sympathized with the Confederacy. None of that mattered. They sold to the Union because the Union had the contracts. Ideology yielded to incentive. After the war, DuPont emerged not as a controversial profiteer, but as a patriotic industrial hero. History remembers outcomes, not complexities. World War I elevated DuPont from a powerful company to a true dynasty. Before the United States officially entered the war, DuPont sold explosives to Allied powers in Europe. When America joined in 1917, production exploded. DuPont supplied roughly 40% of all explosives used by Allied forces. Their profits increased more than 15-fold in just 4 years. Those profits did not disappear when peace returned. They were reinvested into chemicals, into materials, into diversification. War-funded peace. World War II followed the same pattern with an added twist. DuPont became a key contractor in the Manhattan Project, operating plutonium production facilities under cost-plus contracts. Cost-plus means something very specific. All expenses are reimbursed, a guaranteed profit margin is added. There is no financial risk. If costs rise, profits rise. By the end of World War II, DuPont had mastered the art of transforming war urgency into permanent wealth. 6 generations later, the family fortune remains immense. But explosives alone do not fight wars. Wars also require fuel. And no family mastered that domain more thoroughly than the Rockefellers. John D. Rockefeller founded Standard Oil in 1870. Within a decade, he controlled nearly 90% of America's oil refining capacity. This was not merely business dominance, it was strategic leverage. By the late 19th century, modern navies were transitioning from coal to oil. Ships, vehicles, and eventually aircraft required petroleum. When the Spanish-American War broke out in 1898, oil became a military necessity. Standard Oil supplied it. The war was brief, but the lesson was permanent. Control energy, and you influence warfare. World War I transformed oil from an advantage into a requirement. Mechanized warfare depended on fuel. Rockefeller-controlled companies supplied petroleum to Allied forces, and through subsidiaries, indirectly to others as well. This was legal and extraordinarily profitable. By the end of the war, John D. Rockefeller became the world's first billionaire. World War II repeated the pattern, even amid public controversy. Rockefeller-linked companies supplied fuel to the U.S. military while maintaining complex international relationships. Congressional investigations later revealed troubling details about technology sharing and pre-war dealings. No executives were imprisoned. The reason was simple. The military could not function without oil. Power creates immunity. By the mid-20th century, Rockefeller wealth had diversified far beyond energy. Banking, real estate, philanthropy. War profits became endowments, foundations, and institutional legitimacy. Yet fuel remained the bloodstream of conflict. Weapons and fuel, however, are useless without financing. Wars require capital, and capital has always had its own winners. Enter the Morgan banking dynasty. J.P. Morgan understood something few others did. Governments at war will borrow at any rate. because the alternative is defeat. From the Spanish-American War onward, Morgan banks financed government borrowing. World War I made this dynamic unmistakable. Before America entered the conflict, Morgan-led banks lent billions to Allied powers. Those loans were used to purchase American goods. The money circulated domestically. The interest accumulated privately. By 1917, the financial exposure was so vast that Allied defeat would have triggered economic collapse in the United States. War became a financial necessity. After the war, Morgan banks profited again by restructuring European debt. Fees were collected at every stage. Financing destruction, financing reconstruction, financing memory. The cycle was complete. By now, the pattern should be emerging. Position before the war. Become indispensable. Profit during the war. Retain wealth after the war. Prepare for the next one. And this pattern did not stop with explosives, oil, or finance. It evolved into aviation, into logistics, into modern defense contracting. And in the next part, we will examine how the military-industrial complex perfected this model in the 20th and 21st centuries, and why it now operates almost beyond democratic control. By the early 20th century, the business of war had outgrown gunpowder, oil, and banking. Conflict was becoming faster, more technological, and exponentially more expensive. This required something new. Not just manufacturers, not just financiers, but permanent corporations whose survival depended on continuous conflict. This was the birth of what would later be called the military-industrial complex. The term itself would not be popularized until President Dwight Eisenhower's farewell address in 1961. But the structure had been forming for decades, and once it formed, it never dissolved. The next major transformation came from the sky. Aviation changed warfare forever. World War I proved that air superiority would determine the future of combat. Reconnaissance, bombing, logistics, all depended on aircraft. This created an entirely new class of war profiteers. Companies that did not exist before war and would not survive without it. One of the earliest was Boeing. Founded in 1916, Boeing's timing was not accidental. As the United States entered World War I, the government desperately needed aircraft manufacturers. Contracts were issued rapidly. Standards were flexible. Payment was guaranteed. Boeing secured military contracts almost immediately. When the war ended, demand collapsed. Many aviation companies failed. Boeing survived because it adapted its wartime infrastructure into civilian aviation while maintaining military relationships. This became a defining strategy. War creates capacity. Peace monetizes it. Preparation ensures the next war restores demand. This cycle would repeat across generations. World War II expanded it beyond imagination. The scale of industrial mobilization was unprecedented. Aircraft production skyrocketed. Weapons systems multiplied. Logistics became a science. Companies like Lockheed, Northrop, General Dynamics, and Raytheon became indispensable. They did not merely sell weapons. They integrated themselves into national defense planning. By the end of World War II, these corporations were no longer vendors. They were partners, and partners are far harder to replace. This partnership was formalized through a specific contract structure that deserves careful attention. Cost-plus contracts. Under cost-plus agreements, the government reimburses all expenses and guarantees a fixed profit margin. This structure removes risk entirely. If costs increase, profits increase. Efficiency is not rewarded. Expansion is. This single mechanism explains more about modern warfare than most political debates combined. Cost-plus contracts incentivize complexity, not resolution. The longer a conflict lasts, the more systems are built. The more systems are built, the more maintenance is required. The more maintenance is required, the longer dependency persists. This is not corruption, it is incentive alignment. And incentives, once embedded, shape outcomes regardless of intention. By the Cold War era, the United States entered a state of permanent readiness. Unlike previous wars, there was no declared end point. There was only threat. This was ideal for defense contractors. The Korean War demonstrated how rapidly temporary mobilization could become permanent industry. Vietnam proved something even more important. War could be politically unpopular and financially indispensable at the same time. Defense spending surged throughout the Vietnam War, even as public support collapsed. Corporations supplying aircraft, munitions, communications, and logistics saw enormous profits. When the war ended, the infrastructure did not shrink. It expanded. New threats were identified. New doctrines were developed. New weapons systems were justified. Peace did not bring contraction. It brought rebranding. The Soviet Union provided the perfect adversary. An enemy large enough to justify limitless spending, yet distant enough to prevent direct accountability. The Cold War lasted nearly half a century. During that time, a handful of corporations received the majority of defense contracts. Lockheed Martin became the largest defense contractor in the world. Its revenues became inseparable from federal spending. Executives moved seamlessly between corporate leadership and government advisory roles. This revolving door was not hidden, it was normalized. Generals retired into boardrooms. Defense officials became consultants. Policy and profit intertwined. This created a feedback loop. Threat assessments justified spending. Spending justified corporate growth. Corporate growth influenced threat assessments. The loop sustained itself. Then came the end of the Cold War. For a brief moment, many believed the military-industrial complex would contract. It did not. Instead, it pivoted. New enemies replaced old ones. Rogue states, terrorist networks, asymmetric warfare. September 11, 2001, marked the most financially transformative event for defense contractors since World War II. Within weeks, Congress authorized open-ended military spending. Budgets exploded, oversight weakened. Emergency powers expanded. The war on terror had no geographic boundaries and no defined endpoint. This was unprecedented, and for certain companies it was ideal. Halliburton, through its subsidiary KBR, became one of the largest beneficiaries. It secured billions in no-bid contracts for logistics, construction, and services in Iraq and Afghanistan. Food, fuel, housing, infrastructure. Every soldier required supply. Every base required maintenance. Every delay increased revenue. Halliburton's profits soared. Its political connections were well documented. Yet investigations produced little consequence. Once again, the reason was structural. The military could not operate without contractors. Private corporations had become operationally indispensable. War was no longer fought solely by soldiers. It was executed by networks. Networks of suppliers, consultants, engineers, analysts, and logistics firms. This changed the nature of accountability. When responsibility is distributed, blame dissolves. Decisions become bureaucratic, outcomes become abstract, costs become normalized. Trillions of dollars were spent in Iraq and Afghanistan. Independent studies later showed that a significant portion went to contractors rather than reconstruction or local development. Yet few individuals were held accountable. Why? Because the system functioned as designed. War had become an ecosystem, and ecosystems resist disruption. At this stage, the pattern is unmistakable. Wars are justified politically, but sustained economically. They generate revenue streams too large to disappear quietly. This does not mean wars are started solely for profit. That would be simplistic. It means that once war begins, powerful incentives ensure it continues longer than necessary. Peace becomes economically disruptive, and disruption is always resisted. This is the uncomfortable truth. The United States does not merely fight wars, it sustains a war economy. An economy where conflict stabilizes employment, profits, and political alignment. An economy where ending wars creates uncertainty, and uncertainty is dangerous to those invested in continuity. In the next part, we will confront the most difficult question of all. If this pattern is real and documented, why does it persist in a democracy? Why do voters, legislators, and institutions allow it to continue? And what psychological mechanisms make it nearly invisible to the public? If this pattern is so consistent, so documented, and so costly, a reasonable question emerges. Why is it tolerated? The United States is not a dictatorship. Wars require funding. Funding requires approval. Approval requires public consent, at least in theory. Yet history shows a paradox. Public opposition to war can be overwhelming, and war spending can still increase. This is not a failure of democracy. It is a feature of psychology. The first mechanism is distance. Modern warfare is deliberately abstracted from daily life. There is no draft, no rationing, no visible sacrifice for most citizens. War exists on screens, not streets. For the majority of Americans, conflict is experienced as information rather than disruption. When war does not directly touch one's routine, moral outrage lacks friction. The costs are real, but they are diffused. Debt absorbs them. Inflation hides them. Future generations inherit them. This diffusion creates emotional insulation. The second mechanism is fragmentation of responsibility. In earlier eras, war decisions were concentrated. Kings declared war. Parliaments funded it. Armies fought it. Today, war is administratively distributed. Decisions pass through committees, agencies, contractors, and allied structures. No single actor feels fully responsible. This is crucial. When responsibility is fragmented, accountability evaporates. Each participant performs a necessary function within a larger system. The system itself becomes morally invisible. The third mechanism is narrative framing. Wars are never sold as economic ventures. They are framed as moral imperatives. Defense, security, freedom, stability. These frames are not invented cynically. They resonate because they are emotionally true to many participants. But framing determines attention. When the public debates morality, it rarely examines incentives. When the public debates strategy, it rarely examines profit. Economic beneficiaries remain outside the frame. The fourth mechanism is institutional normalization. Defense contractors are no longer seen as war profiteers. They are employers, innovators, community pillars. Their facilities create jobs. Their lobbying funds campaigns. Their research feeds civilian technology. This embeds them socially. Criticism becomes uncomfortable. To question war spending is to question livelihoods. This is a powerful silencing force. The fifth mechanism is media dependency. Modern media relies heavily on official sources for access. Pentagon briefings, embedded reporting, expert analysts. Many of those experts have direct or indirect ties to defense contractors. This is not always disclosed. Even when it is, repetition normalizes it. The same voices shape threat perception across decades. Threat perception drives budgets. Budgets drive profits. The loop remains intact. Another psychological factor is fear asymmetry. Fear is easier to mobilize than restraint. A single vivid threat can outweigh years of abstract cost. Humans are not wired to calculate long-term opportunity loss. They respond to immediate danger. This makes war narratives disproportionately persuasive, especially when alternatives are framed as weakness. The Stoic philosophers warned about this tendency. They argued that fear distorts judgment more reliably than ignorance. Fear narrows attention. Fear accelerates decisions. Fear discourages dissent. In such conditions, prudence appears disloyal. The result is moral compression. Complex trade-offs are reduced to binary choices: support or betrayal, strength or surrender, action or danger. Within this compression, economic analysis disappears. But perhaps the most important mechanism is temporal dislocation. The benefits of war profit are immediate and concentrated. The costs are delayed and dispersed. Contracts are awarded now. Profits are booked now. Careers advance now. The costs appear later. Debt interest, veteran care, geopolitical instability. By the time costs materialize, decision-makers have moved on. This temporal gap is decisive. Systems that reward immediate gain while deferring consequences inevitably favor repetition. This is not uniquely American. It is structural, but scale amplifies it. When spending reaches trillions, even marginal inefficiency becomes enormous, and enormous systems resist reform. Reform threatens stability. Stability benefits incumbents. The public senses something is wrong. But sensing is not understanding, and without understanding, opposition lacks direction. People protest wars without confronting the economic architecture that sustains them. As a result, wars end, but the war economy remains. This is why each new conflict feels familiar. Different enemy, same structure. The system does not require perpetual war. It requires perpetual readiness. Readiness requires spending. Spending requires threat. Threat requires narrative. This is the equilibrium. Breaking it would require confronting incentives directly. That would mean redefining national security away from endless projection and toward sustainable defense. It would mean disrupting revenue streams embedded across regions and institutions. It would mean accepting economic adjustment in exchange for moral coherence. History suggests such transitions are rare, but not impossible. They require a shift not just in policy, but in public literacy. Literacy about how power actually operates. Literacy about incentives over intentions. Literacy about structure over spectacle. Without that literacy, reform efforts collapse into slogans. With it, pressure becomes precise, and precision changes outcomes. In the final part, we will confront the most difficult question of all. What does responsibility look like for individuals living inside a system they did not design, but continue to fund? And how can awareness translate into action without illusion, extremism, or despair? There is a moment after patterns become visible when the question changes. It is no longer, is this real? It becomes, what does this mean for me? This is the most uncomfortable transition of all, because it moves responsibility away from abstractions and back toward individuals. No citizen alive today designed the war economy. No voter personally approved its structure. No single administration created the incentives that sustain it. And yet, everyone participates in it. Taxes fund it, pensions invest in it, media attention sustains it, silence normalizes it. This is not accusation. It is reality. The Stoic philosophers made a distinction that is essential here. They argued that moral responsibility does not require authorship. It requires awareness. Once a person understands how a system operates, continued participation becomes a choice, even if alternatives are imperfect. This does not mean withdrawal. It means discernment. Living within a system does not require surrendering judgment to it. History shows that systems rarely change because of outrage alone. Outrage is loud, outrage is temporary, outrage exhausts itself. Change occurs when incentives are disrupted. And incentives are disrupted only when behavior shifts. This is where most discussions fail. They remain at the level of condemnation. But condemnation does not alter contracts. It does not restructure budgets. It does not dismantle feedback loops. Understanding does. The war profit pattern survives because it is insulated from scrutiny, not because it is invincible. Its strength lies in complexity, distance, and diffusion. But complexity collapses under sustained attention. Distance shrinks when citizens demand clarity. Diffusion weakens when accountability is made specific. This does not require radicalism. It requires seriousness. Seriousness in how information is consumed. Seriousness in how narratives are questioned. Seriousness in how representatives are evaluated. Not by slogans, not by alignment, but by incentives. Who benefits? Who bears cost? Who decides? Who profits regardless of outcome? These questions are not cynical. They are civic. A mature democracy does not survive on trust alone. It survives on informed skepticism, the kind that does not assume malice, but does not ignore structure. This is the posture that history rewards. Not faith, not fury, clarity. For individuals, clarity changes posture. It alters how news is processed, how threats are evaluated, how urgency is interpreted. It creates psychological distance from manipulation. Fear loses efficiency. Narratives lose immediacy. Decisions slow and improve. This is not disengagement. It is sovereignty. The war economy thrives on speed. Speed of reaction. Speed of funding. Speed of consent. Slowness disrupts it. Questions delay it. Scrutiny complicates it. Understanding weakens its momentum. This is why awareness matters. Not because it guarantees reform, but because it restores agency. History shows that large systems shift not when everyone awakens, but when enough people refuse to be rushed. When enough people insist on understanding before agreement. When enough people recognize patterns before reacting. When enough people choose literacy over loyalty. The United States has faced moments like this before. Moments when economic structures outpaced moral reflection. Change did not come easily, but it came. Not through revolution, through pressure, through exposure, through time. The war profit pattern is not eternal. It persists only as long as it remains invisible. Once visible, it becomes defensible or dismantleable. That decision belongs not to corporations alone, not to politicians alone, but to citizens capable of holding complexity without collapsing into cynicism. That is the quiet responsibility of intelligence. If you have stayed with this analysis to the end, it suggests something important. You are not seeking outrage. You are seeking orientation. Orientation in a system designed to overwhelm. Orientation in narratives designed to simplify. Orientation in an economy that benefits from confusion. That matters, because orientation precedes meaningful choice. If this work helped clarify rather than inflame, that is its purpose. If you believe conversations like this deserve continuation, not as noise, but as serious inquiry, staying connected ensures that depth is not displaced by spectacle. A measured signal helps this reach others who value understanding over certainty. And if you choose to share it, do so intentionally, not publicly, but personally. Send it to one person you trust. One person who would actually want to discuss it. One person who understands that disagreement is not disloyalty. If you leave a comment, make it thoughtful. Not agreement, not praise. Contribution. Because intelligent dialogue is the only counterweight to systems that rely on speed, fear, and distraction. This video was not created to tell you what to think. It was created to show you where thinking must begin. The rest is choice. And choice, informed and deliberate, remains the last freedom no system can monetize.